talk some more about classes, right? What is a class? The blueprint, right, for objects, for instances, right? We define fields, we define methods, right? We can define, let's do something super simple. Whatever, yeah. Let's define, and I'm call it my point. A point class. We have x and y, right? Those would be what? X and y would be fields or methods? Fields, right? Or instance variables, right? Should we make them int or double or what? Int. What is the best access modifier for them? Should people be able to access them from the outside or not? If we make them public, then people on the outside can access them and go change them. Is that good? Maybe it is, right? But maybe not. We can make them private and then nobody can touch them, right? If we make them private, we probably want to have some way of setting them and then some way of reading them, right? We can define a constructor that lets you define those values at the beginning when you create an object, right? Syntactically, what's the difference between a constructor and a regular method? Doesn't have a return value, has the same name as the class, right? And we probably want to make this public so other people can access it, right? We set the x of the object that's being constructed, so that's this dot x to be the parameter x, and this dot y equals y, right? This is the object's x, and this is this parameter. If you're getting confused, change the name of your things so they don't match, right? We could do getX, right? Takes no parameters. What do we return? But what value? Int is the type. What would be the value to return? This dot x, right? And you can just write x. This is extra, but I'll be writing it for now. Does that make sense? So in here, I can actually not import java.awt and do things like my point p equals new my point 1020. What would this print? 10, right? Does this make sense? You are reasonably familiar with the syntax, and if not, you'll go do 500 more to get familiar with the syntax, right? Just to show it, it's not always a good idea. If we were to do a method to set the x, what would it look like? What do we return when we are setting stuff? We normally return nothing, right? And we get the value that we want to put as the parameter, right? We can have other, right? This is kind of very common thing in Java to have get x and set x for whichever variables you have. We could have other things that do more complicated stuff to our values, something like public void translate x. We're going to translate our point on the x dimension, which means we just add that delta x, right? We could have a similar for y. And then in here we could do stuff like p dot translate x minus 5. Now if we were to print this, instead of 10 we would get what? 5, right? Does that make sense? Reminder, you either define your classes in a file with the same name as the class and actually the same folder structure as your packages, or just make everything static and have only one public class, right? One public non-static class. But this is a much better practice. Just that I sometimes cheat and make everything static just to fit it in one file and make it easier to go from one thing to the other. Does this idea make sense? You can probably come and complete all the other stuff that you could do, right?
Translate is just a general word that means to change in some way.
Translate means to move, right? And so this is graphics or vectors.
Okay.
It's either graphics or linear algebra, depends on how you think about it. And translate is just move. Now let's do one that is actually most of the time we tend to do simple values, right? But you could do things like this. We could have an accumulator, something to which we're going to be doing operators and it eventually operations and it eventually tells me what's the answer, right? So I could have a constructor probably want to make this public, probably want to make this private. So our accumulator will keep, right? Imagine there is like a register on your calculator, right? You can say add 5, subtract 3, multiply times 2, right? So in this case, what do we do? If you ask me to add another value, Does this make sense? Is value a good name, or should we choose something else to not confuse you? Do you care? Change it? Or something like this? Other value? What would subtract do? Sorry? It would just subtract, right? Minus equal instead of plus equal. I would use it like
Typically make your methods regularly the same. Does that matter?
they are completely independent, so they are not the same, right? They're just, I tend to make the same when they do the same thing exactly. It's more like English, right? And if you think about English, they usually tell you to not do it, right? If you think about literature, they will probably tell you use different names to make it more interesting, right? If you think about something like technical writing, they will tell you do it the same, principle of least surprise, right? So I tend to do it the same so that when it is the same, when it's not the same, then I'll come up with different names. But so we can do a.add 5. Yay! Does this make sense? I tend to not do this, but this is actually very common in object-oriented programming, right? Your object is keeping state and you're modifying that state over and over. My objects usually tend to be super simple, but
Go back to at the top. Okay, so that's just a. Okay, so that's just a constructor. So the top method is.
yeah.
How would you know we get the 30?
How do we get 30? We started at 10, we add 5, so we should get 15.
Okay.
We multiply it times 2.
Okay. Oh, and then give you exactly the addition separate and it just output the two.
I'm just outputting the end. It didn't output anything until I printed stuff.
How about if I want to see the addition and multiplication rows?
What do you mean? If you want to see the value before adding, the value after adding, and the value after multiplying, you print the value.
Oh,
They
I was
usually
expecting that.
your printing is a very global thing. When you print stuff, right, you just destroyed my screen. I was trying to have it all lined up and you just printed manure, right? My screen just looks like manure now. You should not print unless you have it in big bold letters that you're doing something, right? Normally, your stuff should not change anything but itself, right? The object can change itself, should not access any global variables, any global state. Somebody else should call it and print the value, but not the object. It's usually a terrible idea to print stuff. It is not a terrible idea to do it while you are creating your stuff and while you're, right? But it's a horrible idea in general. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
If you don't put this, these statements like system.out.println, so it won't show the result
No, why would it? You have it here.
because
You have the result. The accumulator changed, right?
in last one also we
If you don't do it,
yeah
then you just changed it and then didn't do anything with it in the end.
it
So
won't show the result.
no, it won't show it until you. It won't show it unless you show it, right? If you don't print anything, then nothing should be printed. So normally, in a way, only main should print. Not only main should print, but right. The accumulator should not print, right? It's called an accumulator, not a printer. Usually, your things should do one thing only. The name of the class should more or less tell you what it does. An accumulator just accumulates, probably more a register than an accumulator, but does this make sense? In this case, we're just keeping state, right? Let's do another one. Let's do one that does what would be, sorry? Oh, yeah, turtle. That's what you have to do, right? And it is similar, right? The turtle is keeping state, and you tell it to do things, and it changes its own state, right? That's what the turtle is doing for assignment 6. Let's do one that would have this is kind of his interface. Right? You are going to be adding values, so you have add value, add value, add value, and then you can ask the number of values, and you can ask for the mean. Does that make sense? If we are going to implement this, what data do we need to keep? Do it in your mind. 10, 15, 20. What's the mean? What's the number of values?
You need all the previous values and you need the number of total values.
Well, you could keep all the previous values and the number of total values. Do we know how to keep all the previous values? Does the accumulator keep all the previous values? It's going to overwrite. So we don't know how to
You
keep
need
all the
sum of
previous.
all the values, and then you need the number of
Yes, you need the sum of all the values, right? And the number of values, and then you can calculate the mean. Does that make sense? So what do I do when you tell me to add a value? Okay, add it to the sum. So sum equals what? Plus sum?
Value.
Sum plus equals value. Right, so I add the value to the sum, and what else do I do? You don't have to, but it's not a bad idea.
Plus, that.
No, you don't really need the this, right? If there is no opportunity of confusion when you just do non-values, then it will do this dot non-values, right? The this is just so you don't get confused. Does that make sense? By default, Java knows who you are talking about. So when you say sum, it knows that it's this is sum.
So why are we incrementing non-values?
Because now you added one more value, right? Now how many values? So what is...
Do you always say this dot?
I tried to do it for like this week. I never do it.
Okay.
In real life, people never do this dot. But you're not people yet. No. But it's a good idea to be reminded of it at the beginning, right? Until it becomes second nature, and then you start
Is
dropping
there
it.
a opposite of this, like that dot? Or
No.
Something else? Dot?
No, there is super sometimes.
Super, okay.
But we'll talk about that later. But no, there is no, unless your parameters, you can call them that or whatever. It's actually fairly common to do that. Does this idea make sense? So what is get number of values is what?
Value this dot.
Or this dot no value. And what's get mean? How do we... Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, sure, why not? We haven't seen how to do those things, but... What did we call? Stats calculator.
So we didn't include a constructor, but there's a default constructor.
There is a default constructor that does absolutely nothing. But that's perfect. And then, yeah, actually, yeah. This is weird. This initialization, right? But
Why is that weird?
because it's kind of a constructor, but it's syntactically it's not a constructor, right? It happens as if it was part of the constructor. But syntactically it's there. You could have a constructor, right?
Do you ever use the constructor generator or the set get generator?
Not in this class.
Okay.
Don't use it in this class. Make your fingers get used to it. In real life, of course. But definitely don't do it in this class because you want your fingers to get used to typing stuff, right? After you're done, you can do code generate and have it generate a constructor and toString and those kinds of things for you, but you don't want to do it right now, right?
So for good readability and best practice, this is more like what you should actually.
No, I would rather do it the other way, but
I mean, just what you've written right here, not the generator, but you'd rather do it double sum equals 0.
I would rather do this because that's right there. It's in one place as opposed to in two, right? So if I do it this way, it's in one place as opposed to, oh, let me go see what the constructor did.
Oh.
But that's me. You could define the constructor. You could.
Okay, but there's not. Okay, it's not like someone's gonna fire you or something. It's just. Kind of
Probably not. A lot of that stuff, when you probably not. I don't know.
Okay.
When you join a team, you get socialized to whatever, right? I tend to be relatively flexible in that stuff. It's like it doesn't terribly matter, right? I mean, I'll get used to whatever, but it doesn't terribly matter. We can do it whichever way. I tend to not terribly mind. Some people are very anal retentive about that stuff, and so you negotiate it with your team. There are also tools that will do that kind of maneuver for you. Usually with stuff like indentation, you normally want an agreed upon standard for how you indent and a tool that enforces it so you don't have to think about it, right? And then stuff like we have like code style reviewers and things like that, right? So when you send a pull request, it will go and look and say, oh, you have, I don't know, stuff like you have typos in your variables. That's probably a terrible thing, right? Or your variables are only one letters. That's probably a terrible thing other than stuff like IJ, right? Your variables shouldn't be one letter. They should have some meaning, right? Stuff like your method has 20 lines. You are doing it wrong. You should break it on the functions, right? Those kinds of things. They are great for computers. Computers are terribly anal retentive. They will actually go validate that stuff always, and so you normally want to automate that stuff so that it's whichever thing you're doing gets validated. I thought about doing that with forcing you to put braces for if statements and things like that, but I decided against it. It's one of those things. How do we use this guy? Oh, we did that, right? And then here we can just do let's see dot. We should get 20. Yay! What other kinds of things do we want to do? Do we want to learn more math? There's a way to calculate the standard deviation the same way. There's a formula for calculating the standard deviation. Standard deviation, one pass. Oh, of course. I mean, I know how to calculate it in two passes, but not in one pass. In one pass, you do this. Yeah. Basically, you are supposed to do, right, in order to calculate the standard deviation, the two-pass string is every element minus the mean n squared, right? But you can actually expand this, and then that becomes this. So if you keep track of this is what the sum that we already have. This is the sum of the squares. So we could do this dot sum squares plus equal so we have return this is the sum of the squares divided by n.
That one is variance.
Sorry?
This is for variance side. For standard deviation should be in other squares.
Yeah, that might be true.
Well, that's standard deviation.
No, this is the right thing. If you calculate the square root of this, then you get the other guy.
No, standard deviation is square root of variance.
Yes, so it is this. And then if you calculate the square root of this, you get the variance. Or the other way around. Oh, so this would be the variance, not the standard deviation? Yeah. So this would do the squared. Yeah. So, get variance. Thank you. So this would be sum squares divided by num-values minus sum times sum. Is that variance? Yeah. Right? Then we can actually do we can use the Newton-Raphson algorithm for calculating the standard the square root, but we're not going to do that. Maybe this will actually work. My mean is 20, so my variance is 10. 10, so it's going to be 200 divided by 3, so it's 66-ish. And my standard deviation is the square root of that, which is 8-ish or something like that, right? Oh, it doesn't work. Not a number. Because this is negative, so there is no square root. For floating point, you have kind of plus infinity, minus infinity, and not a number. What did we do wrong? This is the other way around, right? No, that is... This is not sometimes sum. this is get mean times get mean. Okay. Just for fun, let's do a toString, right? What do we do? How do we print this? We could do something like this, right? Or maybe so that allows me to do stuff like toString will be called when something needs to be converted into a string. Is this cool or what?
It was a lot simpler than I thought.
Yeah, it is simple. Everything is simple once you build these 700 steps to it, right? Any questions about classes? Do you want to do more examples? What would be good examples?
Usually they have to do shapes at some point.
We will do shapes. We will do shapes. Of course, everybody has to do shapes. But that's for inheritance. We can do some of those things, right? Actually, let's do, because one thing that we haven't done, yeah, let's do this. New Java class, circle. What's a circle? What do I keep for representing a circle? Radius, okay.
Constant high.
Well, I need the radius and then I need its center, right? What's a center? What's the center of a circle?
That's a point.
It's a point.
Yeah.
Oh, I just created a point class, right? Well, I called it my point, so. Does this make sense?
Okay, so you just call a point.
I'm not calling it, I'm including an object, right? Just like I could include any kind of object, just like I included strings in other places, right? But in this case, the object is my point. And it's horrible because these are ints, but oh well. I'm not gonna make them double. Let's make the radius an int too, even though it's not very useful. Right? So what do I do here? Just Does this make sense?
So that's where you really need, you do need to say this dot radius.
In this case, I do
Yeah.
because I call this
Otherwise,
radius.
it would be confused in this case.
It wouldn't be confused. It would think that you're talking about the parameter again, and this would be a line that has no effect whatsoever,
Okay.
right? Wouldn't be confused. It's perfectly okay with what you did. You just said something dumb. The compiler is happy about it. Compiler doesn't know what is dumb and what isn't dumb. The other way, of course, is to call this something like p radius, and then you can do it this way. It is probably not a bad idea, right? If the names confuse you, use different names. It's perfectly okay. Different people get confused by different things. Let's do slightly more interesting things here. How can I calculate the distance to another point? How do you calculate the distance between 2 points? X squared, right? The distance in x squared plus the distance in y squared, and you calculate the square root of that, right? So it is given that I'm squaring, it doesn't terribly matter. Does this make sense? So now, it's 200, square root of 200, which, yeah, sounds 15-ish. The first one should be 0, right? The distance to itself should be 0 or very close to 0, and the other one should be 14-ish. Cool. So on my circle, I could do stuff like Boolean, and this should be public, right? Now you need to start getting used to do public. Now you understand what was the public static stuff, right? Does the circle contain the point? How do you know whether a circle contains a point? Sorry? If it's inside, what does that mean? The distance to the center is less than the radius, right? That's what a circle means, right? All the points that are closer, right? The circumference is all the points that are exactly at the radius. The circle is all the points that are inside, right? So less than or equal than the radius. So that would be super simple, right? Return center dot distance p less than or equal to radius. Right? So here I could do circle C1 equals new circle of 10, 10, and radius of 5, right? Then I could ask C1 dot contains, let's do 12, 12 with a radius of 5, right? Does it contain P1?
Yeah. Yes.
Does it contain P2?
No.
No, right? Isn't this cool? Now we are starting, right, to take objects as parameters and doing things with them, right? We had done that with methods anyway, but now we are doing it, right? How about how do I know if two circles intersect?
If the centers of the circles are distance between the two centers of the circles is less than the radius.
Which radius?
The largest radius.
Not the largest, the sum of the radiuses, right? Because they could be.
Or the average.
Smallest circle is inside of the
Can we
biggest.
make it
No,
intersect
it's
two
not.
circles?
It's not inside. It is.
They should have to intersect.
It is. It's.
20 equals.
It is right. They could be like this. It's just intersection, right? Whether they intersect. So if the distance of their centers is less than the sum of the radiuses, right? Sounds reasonable enough?
Because if it equals, then they're just.
If it equals, then
Yeah.
they're touching each other at exactly one point. They're tangent to each other. Yeah. Right? So what could we do?
Wait, that's not an intersect if they're touching each other?
They're touching each other, yes. They intersect by exactly one point, right? If they are any closer, then they'll have a bigger intersection, right?
Alright, so then if the distance between the two center points is less than or equal to the sum of the both circles radius?
No center, radius.
What's that?
Does it make sense? How is it that I can use that? This is a magic keyword. What is that?
What do you mean? It's just a parameter.
Just a parameter, right? This is magic, that is not.
Yeah, the this keyword is sometimes you don't need to use it all. Sometimes like for the getter, whatever you have to.
15, 15, 1. The intersect. Does it intersect C2? How about C3?
2 and 3, or 1 and 3?
1 and 3. No, how about 2 and 3? We did 1 and 2 and 1 and 3, so we should get true false again. Yay! Isn't this cool?
Going back to the circle class. Alright, so like to do a getter, do you always have to use this for that?
No, this, no. Normally you don't. This is just extra syntax so you don't get confused.
Return get radius?
Should be just radius.
Oops, sorry. Radius, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. Okay.
Sorry.
So you don't absolutely have to use it, but just the way you write it might be very useful.
Exactly. It is useful to not get confused. It's useful to remind you what you're doing, right? And for something like this, I would definitely, it makes the code nicer. Makes the fact that those two things are actually symmetrical, right? Very easy to see. As opposed to just this code. But it's just a matter of time. You don't need it except in a case like this where there is opportunity of confusion. Other than that, you don't need it. Any other questions? No, you guys can do objects now. Objects and classes. Close enough.
Yeah, I need some practice.
Are you done with your turtles? Are they supporting the world? It's turtles all the way down. No more questions. Life is good. I give you back 10 minutes of your life, 15 minutes of your life. Cool. I will see you guys eventually.